Culture here from the CBN News Channel. We're talking about the modern sexual revolution and how Christians should respond. That and more is coming up.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, welcome to this week's episode of Faith vs. Culture here on the CBN News Channel. I'm Goins-Phillips, joined by my CBN News colleague, Billy Hallowell. Billy, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, and I'm excited to have our guest with us today, Brandon Showalter of the Christian Post. For people who are familiar with Brandon, you probably have heard his podcast, Generation Indoctrination, or he's kind of unpacking and investigating this transgenderism battle that we've been facing here in the United States now for several years. And Brandon, your podcast is entering season 4. Before we talk about the details, it started in 2022, and now, like I said, you're in season 4. Why did you feel the need to really keep going with this investigative podcast?
The reason that we felt like we had to keep going was just because there is so much to cover. And I think one of the main reasons that we felt like we had to do season 4, and I don't know, maybe there will be a season 5. There's still so many unexplored angles, is that sadly, the mass media, the corporate press, has refused to give this issue the kind of critical coverage that it deserves. We at the Christian Post have been, not to toot my own horn or our own horn here, but we've been at the forefront of these issues for many years before the mass media started to give the kind of scrutiny that these issues deserve. I think a lot of that began with legislative battles that first started in 2021 with the first state, Arkansas, passing the first ever ban on chemically and surgically transing minors. And 17 states last year alone passed similar bans. And then that's when you really saw a lot of media coverage. But the Christian Post, as I just said, we've been on this issue for many years. I started reporting on it soon after I got my start here at CP in the summer of 2016. And in 2017, we did an in-depth article series. But we see these issues as existential ones here. And so that was what led to the first season in the fall of 2022. And the response has just been so overwhelming. We've heard from so many people who've been impacted by gender ideology, everyone from parents of kids who are caught up in this social contagion, whose kids have become medicalized and even sterile and surgically maimed in some cases. We've heard from people who are advocating for women prisoners who are now incarcerated with men who claim to be women because the state law, such as in California, allows that, to everything else in between. And so we see, like I said, this issue as existential because gender ideology is the de facto creed of the day in all of the tops of our institutions. This governs everything. You think you won't run into this, or this won't affect you, or that this is just a small issue. I would submit to you that if you think that, you're dreadfully wrong, because this is everywhere. And so because there's so much content, sadly, we felt as though we had to go ahead and do season 4.
You just brought up a number of issues that affect people, children affected by this, obviously, and you cover a lot of this in the podcast. The thing that is on my mind, hearing you talk about that and the fact that the Christian Post has been on top of this, you guys have been covering it. What is it that drives the silence? You spoke a little bit about it, but go a little bit deeper there. Why are the rest of these outlets refusing to cover issues that actually affect people's health and well-being?
My belief that the biggest driver of the silence is because of the way in which trans activists, gender ideologues, all of the people with a lot of social capital in high places, in elite spaces in our culture, have been convinced that this issue is the next frontier of civil rights. And so if trans rights is just a continuation of civil rights from the 60s, the rights for blacks that were absolutely legitimate, the things that Martin Luther King Jr. helped accomplish. And then they sort of tagged this onto gay rights. This is what the good people supposedly believe. And so for much of the media, they have been framing for the last few years this fight as just these oogity boogity conservative Christians who are backward and we shouldn't ever listen to them because they're the bad people, versus the progressive enlightened folks who are just on the right side of history. And so now that's what I have found, though, as a journalist who has been willing to call a spade on this issue, is that there are, in fact, many left-wing people, very secular left-wing people who do not think like we do here at the Christian Post, who are very opposed to the incursion of gender ideology in all of culture. But they can't get a voice because still the media, the media that they usually read is locked down. They are ideologically captured, to use a phrase that I often do. And so left-wing voices are not being heard. And yet we feature them in our podcast. We did so in season 1, and we've got a variety of perspectives in season 4. And as I often like to say, the truth is true no matter who says it. And so we're trying to do at the Christian Post the job that we think more mainstream outlets should be doing, because gender ideology, there's a cross-section of people who are very concerned about what it's doing to women prisoners, what it's doing to children, what it's doing to athletics, what it's doing everywhere. Wherever you see this lie that men can be women, or that humans can change sex, or that this gender exists in a person apart from their biology, wherever lies are sown, you're going to have destruction in its wake. And so there are a lot of people of goodwill on the right and the left alike who are resisting that. And so those are some of the voices we highlight here at CP.
You know, Brandon, I think for years, gay marriage or homosexual marriage was legalized in 2015. And there were so many people at the time who were saying this is going to lead to other things. This is a slippery slope. Do you think that opened the door to a lot of this? I know that's kind of a tricky and certainly controversial question, but do you think this is the result of us sliding further down this slope?
I think that it is, in a way. I will say we at the Christian Post are very much believers in historic Christian sexual ethics. And so that's where we land. I've had some conversations with LGB identified people, if you will, who are very opposed to this trans thing. Some of them acknowledge how certainly all of their political organizations and their apparatus that they had to accomplish the Obergefell ruling in 2015 was indeed the same that has been foisting this trans ideology on the culture. And I think there's a broader philosophical discussion that needs to be had about what I think Carl Trueman refers to as the psychologized self, where if you're going to define people based on sexual inclinations, it's not that much of a leap then to define people on the basis of gender feelings, if you will. But that said, I mean, we are willing to speak with people who, even if they disagree with us on sexual ethics, sexual morality, I want to be a fair kind of person. I can understand and I concur largely with the slippery slope argument there. And yet, again, this is a kind of a complicated issue because this is bringing together an unusual cross-section of people, including some who place themselves among the LGB who are opposed to this. And so I think, and what I thought when I saw the Obergefell ruling happen in 2015 was that we would see the next thing was going to be polyamory. And we are seeing some of that. I think in Somerville, Massachusetts, it's like you can have up to 6 people in a polyamorous relationship, and the city will recognize that. There was a case out in Florida where a judge awarded custody of a child to an all-male throuple. So that has happened, but I wasn't prepared for the transing of kids to be the next thing. So it kind of took me by surprise, but I think there's absolutely some merit to the slippery slope argument, even though that was called a fallacy or whatever. I think I saw it best where I think it was a Georgetown professor who said, and it made me laugh, but I agreed with it, that the slippery slope fallacy is just basically a breezy dismissal of, forcing people to come to not wanting to see people have to force to defend the logical conclusion of what they are saying. It's something like that. I'm not capturing it exactly, but no, there actually there is some merit to the slippery slope prophecy, as I call it, from those who predicted that this devolution of marriage and sexual ethics is going to lead to other things. But I would also point out that I think it even started long before the Obergefell ruling. The breakdown of marriage and family happened long before Americans were considering whether or not same-sex marriage should be legal in this country. The sexual revolution has a long tail.
Yeah, I think this is an important topic, and that's why, one, we wanted to have you on the show to talk about it, but also, of course, why you're doing the work that you're doing over at the Christian Post. All right, everybody, we're going to fit in a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Faith versus Culture. Stick with us. Welcome back to Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. We are joined by Brandon Showalter over at the Christian Post, talking about season 4 of his new series, Generation Indoctrination. Something, Brandon, that I want to ask you how you see this issue playing into the presidential election this cycle.
I see this issue as something that it's kind of quietly brewing beneath the surface in this election. It hasn't bubbled up to the top. It may, here we are about a month out. It's entirely possible that this may continue. This may eventually become a topic of considerable discussion with regard to Trump versus Harris, or this season is so crazy. So who knows? Who knows? Like, there's so many wild things happening. 2 assassination attempts against Trump, for example, that I just think we're in a very unpredictable time. There hasn't been the kind of focus at either convention on these kinds of issues, though it's been cropping up here and there a little bit. But I think that this is something that's on the minds of a lot of people, especially with regard to parental rights in schools, but also the medicalization. It's harder to get attention on things like women's prisons, and sports has been interesting. Well, Americans love their sports, and so I think what's on most people's minds is the economy and the border. That's what this election is largely about. But this is brewing, and so I anticipate that if Harris is in the White House, that there will be an extreme furtherance of this ideology, because the LGBTQ ideologues basically run the Democratic Party, and they never take no for an answer. They will do whatever they want, and they'll use the Democratic Party to accomplish their ends. The Republican Party, should Trump prevail, I anticipate that there will be some pushback. How much, I really don't know. He's made statements in the past saying that he's going to push back against the medicalization and surgery on children, and I would anticipate that, given what Republican legislators have done in the states, that there would probably be some policies that would be more favorable to what we as Christians would like to see in the interest of protecting children and other vulnerable people. But, you never really know. Sometimes things just don't go the way you predict they will. I mean, we're seeing countries in Europe, for example, that are very left-wing and progressive, certainly compared to America, that are walking back. Sweden, Finland, these are not conservative Christian countries, and they are pushing back against the medicalization. They're backpedaling significantly. England as well. The Cass report came out earlier this year, which recommended against doing these treatments for children who are gender confused. And so history can be very strange, but I do think that as long as we keep telling the truth about what's really happening, we will eventually outrun the activists. And trans activists are not nice people, just by and large. And so people get sick of that. And if we keep telling the truth, we will eventually prevail. It's just, do we have the determination to be relentless enough to keep doing it? And we at the Christian Post say yes.
One of the things, just to shift gears a little bit, that you've talked a lot about are the detransitioners. And a lot of people may not know who these individuals are. Some people who follow conservative media or read the Christian Post or Christian outlets would know, because we've all covered some of these individuals. But talk about why you felt it was important in this season in particular to address the detransitioners.
You're right. In this season, we do focus a lot on those who are helping resist gender ideology on all fronts, including those who are trying to help detransitioners, their families. In episode 1, for example, we talked to lawmakers and policy advocates and other activist types who are trying to help these victims of a medical scandal. When I think about what gender ideology has unleashed on the world, it has done many things, but the worst harm, in my opinion, has been destroying the health and the bodies of children and young people. We've got girls as young as 12 and 13 getting their body parts, their breasts removed. And they've been rendered sterile if they've taken blockers and hormones. And even if a young woman, for example, takes testosterone for several years, her uterus will have atrophied, because that's what the synthetic testosterone does to the female body. If you take it and it throws your hormones out of whack, then you'll have to have a prophylactic hysterectomy. So we're sterilizing young people, and detransitioners were sold a bill of goods. They were told that this will improve their well-being, that this is the pathway to becoming their truest, most authentic self, as the lingo goes. And then their bodies break down and they realize it was all a lie. And so some of them have decided to become advocates and say, no, this is wrong. Don't do this. Don't allow children to give consent to this. Children can't consent to this. Please hear us. Our health was severely impacted. Some of them are now suing the doctors in the surgical centers that maimed their bodies. And they have not had a voice so much, except in very recent years, where I think I first saw a profile of several of them in the New York Post in 2022. Pamela Paul at the New York Times did a great lengthy op-ed about detransitioners and others who have been pushing back against this. It's just now started to appear a few places in mainstream media coverage, but largely thanks to Elon Musk, who purchased Twitter, now X. The detransitioners' testimonies in the 17 states legislatures last year has been very effective. Those videos have been widely seen, and so people were able to hear directly from these people about what it did, how it devastated their health, how it ruined their lives. And that's not me being hyperbolic. When you're cutting off body parts and you're taking drugs that have never been approved for the psychological condition of gender confusion, you can really damage yourself. And these detransitioners, unfortunately, had to learn all that the hard way.
Brandon, as we're kind of rounding out the conversation, I think it's important to talk about what where you're hopeful. Because as Christians, we know we are hopeful. We're hopeful people. And we know that there are things that are encouraging in the midst of something like this, as devastating as this battle has been. But as somebody who's really in the trenches, there's plenty that is concerning and that we need to sound the alarm bells on. But what have you been encouraged by? Are you seeing anything that is giving you some hope? I know you mentioned the detransitioners there who are starting to raise their voices, but as we're leaving here, what is something that can encourage people who are listening to this conversation?
Well, I have been working on this journalistically for around 8 years. And so it's a long time to be pushing against what feels like a 50-ton boulder because of how immense it is and because of the ideological capture at the tops of our institutions, governments, hospitals. It's everywhere you go, and it's people in high places, top-down social engineering. And yet the truth does stand alone. And if you keep telling it, eventually you'll prevail. I mean, but that's just the key, to keep telling it. And so I think it's as a result of journalists like me and others who we just decided to keep telling the truth that then led to the widespread pushback that we're seeing. Whatever people think of the legislation, I know people who don't think that the red states who are resisting this legislatively did the right thing because of how it politicizes this issue further. What it did do, indisputably, is it created cultural awareness. And so that's as a result of truth telling. And so as we see this kind of pushback, and I've heard conversations from people who are in groups that have furthered this ideology shamelessly, that they are now getting nervous, that they see the culture waking up, and that they don't think that they're going to win this particular fight from their perspective. And so it just does go to show that if you are faithful, and if you're relentlessly committed to truthfulness and to reporting the ugly, unvarnished truth no matter what, that will stand, that will last. And Scripture, moreover, is full of examples where a very small minority of people, or one brave person, David and Goliath, you think of, who a giant can fall with one act of courage, and suddenly God shows up and intervenes. God does work through a remnant throughout history, and so I can't think that now is any different, and including this issue. I mean, things can really change on a dime. Can a nation be saved in a day? Isaiah 66 says, yes, it can be. I submit that God is more than capable of rescuing his people and doing great things if we show up and display courage. And so I'm encouraged by the global pushback, and I'm encouraged by some of the things that I see here in the United States. But again, I just think that it's up to us to continue to tell the truth no matter what. And if we do, I believe we will eventually prevail.
Awesome. Everybody, thank you so much for being here. Stick with us. We have a little bit more of Faith versus Culture on the other side of the break. Welcome back to Faith versus Culture. I'm here now with Billy Hallowell. Billy, I think that's, the conversation that we're having with Brandon, it can be discouraging and difficult and kind of a dark subject to talk about, but it's real, right? It's what's happening. It's something that is, it's not abstract. It's having flesh and blood ramifications literally for people in their communities. I think it's important to talk about it, but also encouraging to hear that there are detransitioners who are speaking out. There are 17 states. So I believe in 2022, when Brandon first came out with this podcast, there were not states that had taken action. And in years since, 17 states have put laws in place barring minors from receiving these kinds of transgender treatments, which is encouraging.
Yeah, I think, what he said about speaking the truth over and over again, even when it's difficult, even when it feels like nothing's moving or changing, you have to do that, especially on an issue like this. And even people who are not believers and Christians, they will start to see the truth. And that's what he was speaking about before, too. The fact that all these people in the LGB community are even coming alongside some Christians on this issue and realizing it's gone too far. So you've got to speak the truth. You have to do it fervently. And I think you're going to see more pushback as time goes on. Those 17 states will probably grow and swell, I would imagine, as people learn about this issue.
Everybody, thank you so much for being with us. We'll be right back to wrap up this week's episode of Faith versus Culture. That is all the time we have for this week's episode of Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. Thank you so much for being here. If you haven't already, head over to cbnnews.com. You can subscribe there to our Quick Start newsletter, as well as our Quick Start podcast, and never miss any news of the day. We always go through it from a gospel perspective. Again, thank you so much for being here for this conversation. God bless you.